Yesterday, Gawker announced that they will be shutting down next week. Their other operations like Gizmodo, Jezebel, Lifehacker, and others will continue on under Univision, which bought them for $135 million. But Gawker.com will be no longer. Joining us to talk about what this means for tech journalism, and particularly the honest coverage of the tech elite, is Will Oremus from Slate. Welcome, Will.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going well. Thanks so much for coming on. So you write that Gawker's work was often petty and cheap. Much of it was not reporting at all, but rather, quote, aggregation of news reported elsewhere, filtered through a lens of righteous fury. But you argue that there are still many good reasons to fear the fact that billionaire Peter Thiel was able to essentially sue them out of business. Now, what about Gawker's coverage of the tech industry was so important?
Well, I think the more powerful and secretive an industry is, the more you need fearless people who don't give a crap about the consequences and are going to go after it and try to dig up the dirt that they're hiding. And Valleywag was Gawker's Silicon Valley gossip blog. It was on again, off again over the years. When Valleywag wasn't active, Gawker did some of this itself. Gizmodo sometimes did a little bit of muckraking around Silicon Valley. But there really are few, if any, other publications out there whose mission has been to expose hypocrisy on the part of the tech titans who increasingly control all our information. And I think that's unfortunate. I mean, whatever you think of the approach, the editorial approach or the tone, the reportorial style of Gawker and Valleywag, I think that they will be missed because, the relationship between tech and the media is generally so cozy. And there are all these barriers to getting information about the tech industry. And there are all these incentives against digging up dirt that, it's going to be hard to find a replacement for the type of work they were doing.
So you bring up Gizmodo. I mean, they historically got in a lot of trouble with Apple, posting pictures of a phone, and then they were cut off. Like Apple cut off access to them. But those reporters from Gizmodo are going to still be working. Do you think that they're going to take up this void?
I think it'll be interesting to see who takes up this void. I don't think Gizmodo is really constructed to do what Gawker and Valleywag did, which is to talk about the personalities and the people. Gizmodo is great. I love Gizmodo. And maybe they will do some of this. I mean, Sam Biddle, who was the famous lead writer for the revived version of Valleywag that people remember from a couple of years ago, he was at Gizmodo before he was there. And Gizmodo does have some people right now who are doing some sort of investigative stuff. I mean, they've got Michael Nunez there who found the disgruntled Facebook contractors who would talk about the Facebook trending section and the allegations of bias and sort of expose the way in which Facebook was using humans when it was sort of purporting to be using algorithms. So I think Gizmodo can do some of it. There was news today. I think some of the people who worked at Gawker.com, which is closing down, are moving over to Deadspin, which was originally a sports blog, but maybe broadening its mandate. At least one is moving to Gizmodo. And then you've got all the alumni from Gawker and from Valleywag. I mentioned Sam Biddle. Natasha Tiku was the editor of that sort of latter-day version of Valleywag. She's an excellent investigative reporter, and she is working at BuzzFeed now and doing great work there.
Well, Sam Biddle left for The Intercept, which is a place that we think of as doing a lot of investigative reporting, but they're in some ways beholden to the big tech companies, as is BuzzFeed. I mean, is there anyone? I mean, as Slate, I mean, you guys got your start at Microsoft, right? I don't really know what this connection is still, but I mean, is that part of the problem as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the problem. This is sort of the easy pickings part of the problem, is the ownership issue, where you've got some really visible coziness between tech and the media. When you've got Jeff Bezos of Amazon owning the Washington Post, you've got Pierre Omidyar owning First Look Media, which includes The Intercept. You've got companies like BuzzFeed are relying on VC money from the tech community. That's a sort of an easy place to start. And yes, Slate was started by Microsoft back in the mid-90s as an experiment in online journalism. It's now has no relationship to Microsoft or the Washington Post, actually, which owned us for a while. But I think more insidious in some ways, and deeper in terms of its effects on media coverage of the technology industry, is the way in which all media, and not just the tech media, but all media now rely on these tech companies, Facebook and Google and Twitter and Snapchat, to distribute their work to their readers. The tech companies have become the intermediaries between publishers and their audience. And so if you don't do your work in a way that that is conducive to Facebook's newsfeed algorithm, or Google's Google search algorithm, or in a way that Snapchat approves of enough to strike a partnership deal and put you into Snapchat Discover, then you're at risk of being cut off from your readers. I think that that's a harder relationship to untangle, and it's really, I think, actually more of a problem than the ownership, because at least when Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, everybody knows it, and you can put in place particular editorial safeguards and controls and firewalls, and then you can have the New York Times, knowing that the Washington Post is owned by Bezos, can go really hard on Amazon, as in fact they have. David Streetfeld and others at the New York Times have written some really tough investigative stuff about Amazon.
Obviously we're talking a little bit about a site whose kind of goal is to, kind of look beyond the news that we normally get from a lot of these places and into kind of the news behind the news to a certain degree. I mean, what about alternatives to, publications or sites dedicated to this? What about things like, Twitter or social networks, satire like Silicon Valley, HBO? Do you think they play a role in this at all?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I brought this up on Twitter yesterday before I wrote the piece. Actually, I asked, now that Gawker's dead, who's gonna embarrass Silicon Valley? And it's sort of half joking, but half serious. I mean, obviously, just embarrassing Silicon Valley in itself probably isn't that noble of an end. But who's going to write the stories that Silicon Valley doesn't want written? Who's going to expose the hypocrisy, that kind of thing? And I think one of the responses that I got from several people was, look, this happens on Twitter now. When Gawker started, when Valleywag started in the mid 2000s, there was no Twitter. There was no social media really. Blogs were the only outlet for this kind of thing. Now you can have reporters. You've got reporters like I shouldn't even name names because there are so many, but you've got reporters who cover tech in a relatively straight-laced fashion for mainstream publications, but then they sort of moonlight on Twitter as the people who poke fun at the individuals behind these companies and who make fun of the products. So I think that's part of it. And yeah, I think actually the HBO show Silicon Valley, the more I thought about it, the more I think that has sort of taken up some of the void that was left by the demise, the second demise of Valleywag a year or two ago. And in fact, if you watch HBO and you're familiar with if you're familiar with all the stuff that Valleywag covered over the years, a lot of the plot lines in HBO are like ripped straight from Valleywag. I mean, obviously there are plenty of other sources there too, but Dan Lyons, who was a Valleywag editor for a short time, was actually a writer on Silicon Valley. So the satire is there, but who's digging up the new dirt that that will fuel future seasons of Silicon Valley? That's a harder question to answer.
Yeah, and you also write about oppositional reporting, that in general, and traditional journalism had oppositional reporting, but tech journalism doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, so there are sort of two strands here. I mean, I don't want to overstate the sort of nobility of what Valleywag was doing. I mean, a lot of what they were doing was cheap shots. I mean, it was funny, it was entertaining. Some of it, sometimes they had real scoops. Sometimes they broke stories that were of genuine public interest. A lot of times, I think what they were about was just sort of puncturing the facade that, the we're making the world a better place facade that Silicon Valley is so successful at projecting, and getting to the sort of flawed humans that are behind these companies that are foisting their ideals on all of us. But there's also another strand that is somewhat different, and that is serious, sober, investigative reporting. Thankfully, we still have some of the big mainstream legacy publications, the Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post to some extent, who have reporters who don't give a crap whether they're invited to the next Apple launch event or whether they get put on Snapchat Discover. They've been doing the hard work of investigative journalism for years and decades, and they keep doing that. And they do that sometimes in the tech industry. You look at Wall Street Journal breaking the Theranos story. I mean, that was really essential reporting. It's a different kind of reporting than Valleywag did, and obviously Gawker and Valleywag's death doesn't prevent that from continuing to happen.
Yeah, you said you didn't want to name names, but you do in the story, and it's a great list of reporters. And I think about Kashmir Hill is one of the names that you mentioned from Fusion. She's great. I'm a huge fan of hers. And yeah, I mean, she uncovers these stories without being petty as like Gawker does. So it's people are able to do it, and I hope they continue to do it. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Will. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Will Oremus is a reporter at Slate. He is on Twitter, fighting the good fight at Will Oremus. Thanks so much for coming on.